Hannah woke to the sound of her alarm clock, with the morning sunlight beginning to filter through the curtains. She got out of bed and stretched her arms. The day was planned, as usual. She went to the kitchen to prepare her usual breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of freshly brewed coffee. Hannah was dressed in a comfortable yet elegant outfit, and she headed out for work. The fresh morning breeze wrapped around her, and she took a deep breath, appreciating the quiet before heading to the advertising agency where she worked. The commute was peaceful, and, as always, she enjoyed the familiarity. At the office, Hannah was known for her competence as a creative director. She was methodical in her decisions, respected by her colleagues, but maintained a polite distance. "Good morning, Hannah," said Rachel, her assistant, handing over a summary of the upcoming campaign. "Thanks, Rachel. I'll review this and get back to you by noon," she replied with a quick smile. The day went by efficiently. Hannah moved from one task to another, crossing off items on her carefully organized list. When the workday ended, she prepared to head home. The evening unfolded with the same calmness. She watered her plants as usual, ensuring each one received the necessary care. Her dinner was simple, just a salad she had bought from the market. After dinner, she threw herself onto the couch with a book. It was almost midnight, and Hannah, already sleepy, was getting ready to go to bed. She set the alarm for the next morning, but as she read in bed, a strange noise caught her attention. It was a faint cry, almost imperceptible. She paused, trying to listen more closely. It seemed to come from one of the neighboring houses. She thought it might be just the wind or some ordinary night sound, so she went back to her book. In the days that followed, Hannah's routine continued as usual: early breakfast, work, and quiet evenings. But the distant cry lingered in her mind. She heard it again on other nights, always at the same time, always faint but persistent. One afternoon, upon returning from work, she noticed her neighbor, Sophie, on the porch with her phone. Sophie was reserved and rarely appeared outside. "Hi, Sophie," Hannah called out in a gentle yet contained tone. Sophie waved back with a shy smile before going inside again. Hannah stood watching for a moment, intrigued. Something about Sophie's house seemed different lately, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. That night, the crying was louder. Lying in bed, Hannah strained to listen more closely. It was unmistakable now. It sounded like a child. She furrowed her brow, trying to understand. The street where she lived was quiet, where everyone knew a little about each other's lives. Could Sophie have visitors? It was hard to believe a child would be crying so late at night. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the sound and fall asleep, but she couldn't. The next morning, Hannah felt exhausted, the effect of a fragmented night's sleep. At work, she struggled to focus, something that rarely happened. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, but no one commented directly. "Good morning, Hannah," said Rachel as she dropped off more reports on her desk. "Good morning, Rachel." "Thanks," Hannah replied, forcing a smile. She tried to focus on the documents in front of her, but her mind kept returning to the sound of the crying from the night before. Should she do something? Maybe it was just her imagination. But what if it wasn't? That night, when the crying began again, Hannah found herself at the window, looking towards Sophie's house. It was dark, the lights off. The crying, however, seemed more intense, more anguished. Something wasn't right. She glanced at her phone, considering calling someone. But what if it was a misunderstanding? She didn't want to cause unnecessary trouble. As she pondered, a decision took hold of her. She put on a coat and went out, determined to understand what was happening. When she reached Sophie's house, she hesitated for a second before knocking on the door. The wait felt like an eternity, but finally, the door opened. Sophie stood there, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. "Sophie, is everything okay? I heard something," Hannah began, unsure how exactly to approach the situation. Sophie looked at her for a long moment before opening the door wider and gesturing for her to come in. What Hannah saw inside made her stop. The house was in complete disarray. Something was very wrong. Sophie sighed deeply before starting to explain, her voice trembling. "It's my nephew, Lucas. He came to live with me a few weeks ago, after my sister. Well, something horrible happened. Hannah's heart sank at hearing those words. Now it all made sense. She felt a wave of empathy for Sophie and little Lucas, who was probably trying to cope with his own grief in ways Hannah was only beginning to understand. Yet, as Sophie told her story, something didn't sit right with Hannah. After all these years living next door, how had she never heard that Sophie had a sister? As she returned home, now close to dawn, Hannah looked up at the starry sky, her mind still unsettled. What was really happening in that house? Taking a deep breath, Hannah made a decision. She could no longer ignore it. The idea of letting the cries go unanswered was unbearable. The connection she felt with that unseen child was painfully real. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and called the police. "Hello? My name is Hannah Miller, and I'm concerned about my neighbor. I've been hearing crying from the house next door for several nights. I'm not sure if something is wrong, but it sounds like a child. Please, come check." As she waited, the weight of her decision grew with each passing second. The crying seemed louder now, almost as if it were waiting for a response, an action. The sound of distant sirens finally brought relief. Hannah watched from her window, seeing the flashing lights and the movement at Sophie's house. The police entered, and after what felt like hours, an officer knocked on her door. Sophie had gone through a tragedy. Her sister had recently passed away, and she was left to care for Lucas, her nephew, alone. The boy was traumatized, and Sophie, also grieving, was struggling to handle it all. The following nights were quieter, and life in the neighborhood began to return to its usual rhythm. Yet something had changed within Hannah. She realized that sometimes it takes courage to push past discomfort and act for the sake of others. The experience had made her more aware of how small gestures, like a phone call or a conversation, could have a profound impact. Hannah smiled, feeling warmth in her heart. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said modestly, though she knew not everyone would have had the courage to act. One day, however, when returning from work, Hannah looked at Sophie's house and saw that her car wasn't in the driveway. She had likely gone out to the market. Curiosity quickly took hold of her. A window was left open. It was her chance to discover what was really going on. And so she did. She snuck through the corridor and climbed through the window into the house. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Hannah advanced down the hallway toward a small room, locked with a chain. The padlock and key were right there. As she opened the door, she saw that the boy was chained to the bed. Her heart was racing, but she tried to stay calm. "Hey, I'm Hannah. I'm here to help you," she whispered, trying not to alarm the boy. The boy's eyes were wide with fear. "Are you really going to get me out of here?" he asked in a low, trembling voice. "Yes, Lucas, but we have to be very fast and quiet. Can you do that?" Hannah replied softly. The boy nodded, his small hands trembling as he reached out for hers. Hannah squeezed his hand firmly, offering silent comfort. "Stay close to me and don't make a sound," she instructed, carefully guiding Lucas out of the room. Each step through the house felt amplified, the sound echoing down the empty halls. They reached the back door, and Hannah opened it cautiously, checking to ensure the way was clear. "We're going to leave and go straight to the police station," she whispered to Lucas, who clung tightly to her. Together, they crossed the yard and entered the alleyway, the cool night air enveloping them. The streets were deserted, and the heavy silence only added to Hannah's tension. As they walked through side streets to avoid being seen, Lucas began to stumble, the exhaustion visible in his small body. Without hesitation, Hannah scooped him up, feeling the weight of the boy against her chest. "It's okay, Lucas. We're almost there," she murmured in a calm, reassuring voice. Lucas nestled into her shoulder, exhausted but trusting in the safety Hannah provided. The walk to the police station was a test of nerves. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every noise a possible chase. But Hannah stayed focused, repeating to herself that they were almost there. Finally, the police station came into view, its lights shining in the darkness like a beacon of hope. She quickened her pace, feeling the relief begin to wash over her. Entering the station, she called for an officer and explained what had happened. "Please, help this boy," Hannah said, her voice firm but trembling with emotion. "He was being held captive by my neighbor. He needs help." The officer quickly stood up and asked Hannah and Lucas to sit while he called for backup. Hannah recounted everything she knew, describing the days of captivity and Sophie's strange behavior. Each word hung heavy in the air, and the officer listened carefully, taking notes and ensuring that help would be immediate. Lucas, still clinging to Hannah, looked up at her with eyes filled with both fear and relief. "It's okay now, Lucas. They're going to take care of you," she said, gently running her hand through the boy's hair as he began to relax. As the police prepared to intervene, Hannah sat in the reception area, exhausted but relieved. She knew Lucas was safe now, and Sophie would face the consequences of her actions. The station's lights flickered slightly as Hannah closed her eyes, feeling the tension finally leave her shoulders. The next morning, news of the rescue spread through the town. It was true that Sophie's sister had passed away, but the sister had left a fortune for Lucas as an inheritance, and only with the help of a guardian could the financial resources be accessed. Sophie, being the closest relative, had taken custody of the child, but her real interest was only in the boy's money. Hannah's name was mentioned several times, but she wasn't interested in attention. All that mattered was that Lucas was safe, and that the nightmare had ended. The once quiet town was now reorganizing in the wake of the scandal, and Hannah had become the unexpected hero of the story. In the days that followed, Hannah visited Lucas regularly at the hospital. He underwent exams and began receiving the psychological support he needed. Each visit from Hannah brought a small smile to the boy's face as he slowly began to recover from the trauma. "I brought a book for you," she said one day, handing him an adventure story she had loved as a child. Lucas looked at her with gratitude, holding the book as if it were a treasure. "You're the bravest person I know," he said, his voice still soft but with a new strength emerging. Hannah smiled, touched by Lucas's words. She knew that, despite the difficult journey ahead, Lucas was stronger than anyone could imagine. The nightmare was over, but the impact of that night would stay with them forever. Hannah knew she had made the right decision, and it had changed her forever. She had learned that sometimes it takes courage to act in the face of fear, and that courage can save lives. Hannah had a fiancé, Michael. Michael often traveled, but was now with Hannah. They were about to get married. Hannah had filed for custody of Lucas, and the judge understood that, since Lucas had no relatives nearby, Hannah's presence would help him during this time. However, permanent custody would only be decided on the day of the trial. Hannah hesitated for a moment before reaching out to grab the car, her fingers brushing against Michael's hand. "Thank you," he whispered, almost inaudible. Hannah's visits to the care center had become a constant in the boy's life, a source of security and stability in a still chaotic world. Lucas's presence was like a beacon, radiating confidence and calm, and gradually, Lucas talked about his fears, as well as his dreams and hopes for the future, while Hannah, more reserved, began to smile more and join in the conversations. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Lucas asked Hannah one afternoon, his voice revealing the uncertainty that still lingered over him. Hannah looked directly into the boy's eyes and, with firmness and tenderness, nodded. "Yes, Lucas, it will take time, but you will be okay. Both of you." Weeks turned into months, and Hannah continued to be a constant presence at the care center. On a sunny day, she arrived with a new set of books for the boys and found Lucas playing chess with other kids. The scene made Hannah smile. It was a clear sign of progress, a reflection of their resilience. "Who's winning?" Hannah asked as she set the books down beside them. Lucas looked up at her, smiling, and said, "I think I'm going to win this time." Hannah laughed and joined them, the welcoming environment of the room reflecting the growing confidence between her and Lucas. They still had a long way to go, but moments like this were proof that healing was happening, slowly but surely. Soon after, the day of Sophie's trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with media and curious onlookers wanting to follow the case that had shaken the city. Hannah, sitting in the front row, felt the weight of everything she had witnessed. She knew this was a pivotal moment for Lucas and for her as well. When called to the witness stand, Hannah stood up and walked over with determined steps. She had prepared her testimony carefully, but the memories of the rescue night were still painful. When asked what had prompted her to act, she looked directly at Sophie and replied, "I couldn't stand by while Lucas was suffering. He needed help, and I couldn't ignore that." Hannah's words resonated through the courtroom, and Lucas, watching from the gallery, had tears in his eyes. The final verdict came after long hours of deliberation. Sophie was found guilty on all charges. The room erupted in murmurs, but what Hannah felt at that moment was relief. Not only because justice had been served, but because Lucas was finally free from that shadow. The following weeks brought a new light to the boy's life. The adoption ceremony took place in a small courtroom, surrounded by friends and people who cared. Lucas found a new family, with Hannah and Michael, now married, welcoming him with open arms. The promise of a better life, filled with love and security, was finally within their reach. Hannah watched the ceremony with tears in her eyes, knowing it was the beginning of a new chapter. She approached the boy at the end and, with her voice choked with emotion, said, "I'm so proud of you. You are incredibly strong." "Thank you, Hannah," Lucas replied, hugging her tightly. Michael, soon behind, also came close, and the three embraced, forming an unbreakable bond, forged in moments of pain but strengthened by courage and love. In the years that followed, Lucas grew up, was able to study, and became an advocate for children's rights, channeling his experiences to help others. Hannah, always present in their lives, watched with pride at his journey, knowing that her act of courage had made a lasting impact. Lucas's legacy was not just about survival, but about how to turn pain into a force for change. And Hannah, reflecting on everything that had happened, knew that the path she had chosen, to act with empathy and courage, had changed not only their lives but her own as well. Life went on, full of new opportunities, and the future shone with a renewed promise of hope.